My name is Stephanie Thomas. In this presentation, we'll discuss how statistical analysis can be used to examine class certification issues in employment discrimination litigation. Specifically, we'll talk about the requirements for class certification. We'll talk a little bit about the basics of statistical inference. We'll talk about how statistical analysis factors into commonality and typicality requirements. We'll talk about the difference between a class certification analysis and a merits analysis. And finally, we'll talk about the importance of expert statistical testimony using two examples, Randall versus Rolls-Royce and Dukes versus Wal-Mart. The requirements for class certification are governed by Rule 23A and B of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Rule 23A sets out 4 requirements, and all 4 of these requirements must be met. The first requirement is numerosity. The class is so numerous that joinder of class members is impractical. The second is commonality. There are questions of law or fact common to the class. The third requirement is typicality. The claims or defenses of the class representatives are typical of those of the class. The fourth requirement is adequacy. The class representatives will fairly and adequately protect the interests of the class. Rule 23B sets out 3 requirements, and only one of these 3 must be met. First, prosecution of separate actions risks either inconsistent adjudications, which would establish incompatible standards of conduct for the defendant, or would, as a practical matter, be dispositive of the interests of others. The second, defendants have acted or refused to act on grounds generally applicable to the class. And third, there are common questions of law that predominate over any individual class member's questions, and that a class action is superior to other methods of adjudication. Statistical analysis can be used to address the commonality and the typicality requirements of Rule 23A. So let's talk a minute about the basics of statistical inference. There's 3 steps to every comparative statistical analysis. First, we want to determine the expected outcome from the challenged process for the protected group, assuming no discrimination. We then compare the expected outcome to the actual outcome, and we calculate a disparity measure. And finally, we assess the statistical significance of the calculated disparity. Determining the expected outcome is really the key to the entire statistical analysis. And to formulate that expected outcome, we commonly use probability theory. So let's give a simple example that'll illustrate this point. Let's assume I flip a coin 10 times. Now, out of those 10 flips, we expect 5 heads. This is because the probability of getting a head on any flip is 50%. So 10 flips multiplied by the 50% chance of heads per flip gives us an expected outcome of 5 heads. In the second step, we compare the expected and actual outcomes to calculate a disparity measure. So let's assume that I flip the coin 10 times, and I actually get 10 heads. That's the actual outcome. Now, we expected 5 heads. The actual outcome was 10 heads. The disparity measure is the difference between expected and actual. 5 expected minus 10 actual heads gives us a surplus of 5 heads. Now the third step is where we assess the statistical significance of the disparity. And statistical significance refers to the likelihood that the difference between expected and actual occurred due to simple chance. In our coin flip example, we have to ask the question, is a surplus of 5 heads out of 10 flips enough to conclude that chance is not the cause? And to answer this question, we again turn to probability distribution. Now here we have a probability distribution, and in the first column we see the number of heads, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and 4. The second column shows the probability of getting exactly that number of heads out of the number of flips. So for instance, the probability of getting exactly 10 heads is equal to 0.001. The probability of getting exactly 9 heads is 0.010. Now the third column shows the probability of getting at least as many heads. And that's really just a cumulative probability. So for example, the probability of getting 10 or more heads in 10 flips is 0.001. The probability of getting 9 or more heads is 0.011. The probability of getting 8 or more heads is 0.055, and so on. Now we're expecting to see 5 heads out of 10 flips. That's our expected result. Now what we can do is we can express the difference between what we actually see and what we expect to get in terms of something called standard deviation. And standard deviation is a statistical way of expressing differences in a normalized way. We're going to normalize it, and we're going to abstract from the units of the thing we're measuring. We're going to put it in standard terms. So you can see here in the last column, the probability of getting 10 heads is 3.10 units of standard deviation. The probability of getting 9 heads is 2.3 units. The probability of getting 8 heads is 1.6, and so forth. So we can express the number of heads that we're actually going to see in terms of how likely it is that we will see that effect. Now with the probability distribution, the deviations from the expected results can occur due to chance factors. In fact, 10 heads is expected to occur once in every 1,000 games. The question we have to ask is whether or not the observed outcome is sufficiently rare to conclude that chance was not the likely explanation. The central issue here is, where do we draw the line? How many is too many? Well, the Hazelwood School District versus U.S. decision said that a disparity of at least 2 or 3 standard deviations is statistically significant. The probability of getting 10 heads out of 10 flips with a fair coin is 1 out of 1,000, and that's equivalent to 3.1 units of standard deviation. This satisfies the Hazelwood threshold of 2 or 3 units. The difference between the actual and expected, in this case the 10 actual versus 5 expected, is said to be statistically significant. And what that means is you would reject the null hypothesis of a fair game, and you would accuse me of cheating because the disparity was statistically significant. Now it's important to know that no valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. I'm going to say that again. No valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. If a disparity is not statistically significant, it's statistically equivalent to 0. It doesn't matter how large the disparity is in terms of number of heads or number of people promoted or number of people hired, if the disparity isn't statistically significant, if it's not 2 or 3 units of standard deviation, it's not different from 0 from a statistical perspective. Now there's one more thing about statistical significance that I'd like to point out. Statistical significance is a function of the size of the disparity and of the number of things being studied. And to see this, let's look at the following example. We have here 2 different wagers. In the first wager, we're going to only do 10 flips of the coin. In the second wager, we're going to flip the coin 100 times. So let's start at the bottom, and let's say that in the 10 flip example, I get 6 heads out of 10 flips. That's equivalent to 0.31 units of standard deviation. Now the same 60% out of 100 flips, so this time I'm getting 60 heads out of 100 flips. That's equivalent to 1.9 units of standard deviation. So we can see that when we increased the number of flips from 10 to 100, we got a big difference in the statistical significance measure, even though the proportion of heads was the same. Now let's move up one row and let's look at 70%. So in the 10 flip example, I get 7 heads out of 10 flips. And that difference is equal to 0.95 units of standard deviation. That's not a statistically significant result. It doesn't meet that 2 or 3 unit threshold. So in a 10 flip game, if I got heads 70% of the time, you wouldn't think that that was caused by anything other than chance. However, if we'd look at the 100 flip game, and I still get 70% heads, so I get 70 heads out of 100 flips, that difference is 3.95 units of standard deviation, which does satisfy the Hazelwood threshold of 2 or 3 units. That difference is statistically significant, and we would infer in that case that you were in fact cheated. So we see the same percentage, 70%, whether it's 7 out of 10 or 70 out of 100, and we get different results, we get different measures of standard deviation, and we come to different conclusions. In the 10 flip game, you wouldn't conclude that you were cheated. In the 100 flip game, you would infer that you were cheated. So the number of things we're studying, the number of times we're flipping that coin, the sample size, has a really big impact on whether or not a result is going to be statistically significant. So let's now turn to a discussion of how statistical analysis can be used in class certification. Let's assume we have a proposed class action in which the named plaintiffs allege they were not promoted to management because of their gender. Now, statistical analysis can be used to examine the typicality requirement. And with typicality, the question we're asking is, are the named plaintiffs' allegations typical of the proposed class members? And if our statistical analysis shows an overall disparity in female promotions, that finding can be used to argue the typicality of the named plaintiff's allegations. Conversely, if that analysis reveals an absence of disparity of female promotions, that finding can be used to argue the lack of typicality. Now, when we look at the commonality requirement, the question is there a pattern or practice common amongst the proposed class? And if the statistical analysis shows similar outcomes across different comparison groups, that finding can be used to argue in favor of commonality. Conversely, if the statistical analysis reveals different outcomes across different comparison groups, that finding can be used to argue the lack of commonality. Now, with commonality, we want to study the challenged process or processes across meaningful subsets. And what do we mean by meaningful subsets? We want to construct comparison groups of employees in a meaningful way. And the way in which those subsets are constructed really depends on the facts of the case. Typically, we'll see those subsets constructed according to decision maker, location, functional unit, business line, department. However, the process itself actually occurs within the organization. And we're going to perform those statistical analyses for each individual subset. And then we determine whether there's a common pattern across the subsets. Consider the following example. We have a group of female plaintiffs who allege a pattern and practice of discrimination based on gender. And they allege that males were hired to job A, which is a better job leading to a management position, while females were hired to job B, and job B is a worse job that doesn't lead to management positions. Now here, for the two different jobs, we see the number of applicants, the percent female among the applicants, we see the number of hires, and the percent female among the hires, and whether or not the disparity, that is the difference between the number of females expected to be hired versus the number of females actually hired, is that disparity statistically significant? And we see for both jobs, the number of applicants is 1,000, and 50% of those applicants are female. We also see that for both jobs, 100 hires were made. There were 100 people hired for job A and 100 people hired for job B. Now, when we look at the percentage of female hires for job A, we see that 10% out of the 100 hires were female. When we look at job B, we see that 90% of the 100 hires were female. So for job A, since females were 50% of the applicant pool, we would expect 50% of the hires to be female. So the question becomes, is the difference between the 50 expected and the 10 actual statistically significant? And in this case, it is. We then look at the same kind of question with respect to job B. Since 50% of the applicant pool was female for job B, we would expect 50% of the hires for job B to be female. So we compare the 50 expected hires versus the 90 actual hires, and we ask whether or not that disparity is statistically significant. And in this case, that disparity is statistically significant. Now this analysis addresses typicality. It's looking at the question, are the named plaintiffs' allegations typical of the proposed class members? And in this case, because we see a statistically significant disparity of female hires for both job A and job B, we would infer that the plaintiff's allegations are typical of the proposed class. This analysis, however, does not address the commonality question. If the hypothesis of a pattern and practice of gender discrimination is correct, we would expect to see the same hiring disparity across different locations, decision makers, etc. And because we're looking at a high-level analysis here, everyone hired into job A, everyone hired into job B, across these different locations, decision makers, etc., this analysis cannot answer the question of commonality. For the purposes of our example, let's assume that these 100 hires into job A were made across 5 different locations. And in each of the 5 separate locations, females constitute 50% of the applicant pool. Now the number of applicants varies by location. For instance, in location 1, we had 100 applicants. In location 2, we had 200 applicants. Location 3 had 50 applicants, etc. But in each of those 5 locations, females are 50% of the applicant pool. Now when we look at the hires into job A, we see that for location 1, there were 10 hires made, and 10% of those hires were female. For location 2, 20 hires were made, and 10% were female. In location 3, 5 hires were made, and 20% were female, etc. So the question becomes, for each individual location, is there a statistically significant disparity in female hires? So for the first location, since females are 50% of the 100 applicants, we would expect 50% of the 10 hires to be female. We actually see that of the 10 hires to location 1, only 10% were female, and that disparity is statistically significant. When we look at location 2, since females are 50% of the applicant pool, we would expect 50% of the 20 hires to location 2 to be female. And in fact, females were only 10% of the 20 hires, and the difference between the 50% expected and the 10% actual is statistically significant. And we repeat this analysis for each of the 5 locations. And we can see in each of the 5 locations, we do have a shortfall of female hires. We would expect 50% of the hires in all locations to be female. And we actually see the number of female hires ranges anywhere from 10% to 20% of the actual hires. So we have a shortfall of female hires in each of the 5 locations. This analysis addresses commonality. We're looking at each individual comparison group and performing a separate analysis. Since the decisions are based on location, we're constructing our analysis to examine each location individually, assessing the disparity, and determining whether or not that disparity is statistically significant. So this analysis does address the commonality issue. And in this case, a common explanation, not unique to each location, likely exists to explain the disparities. We have a female hiring shortfall in all 5 of the locations. In 4 of the 5 locations, that disparity is statistically significant. In location 3, that disparity is not statistically significant, but we have to consider that we only made 5 hires in that location. And if we go back to what we talked about before, with statistical significance being a function of the size of the disparity and the number of things being studied, we probably have too small of a sample size to have a powerful test. So in this case, a common explanation not unique to each location likely exists, and class certification is likely appropriate. Now let's look at another example. Let's assume we have a group of female plaintiffs, and they allege that they were denied promotions because of their gender. And we perform a statistical analysis of all female promotions across all divisions, and we find a female promotion shortfall of 16.5 promotions, and this disparity is statistically significant. Now let's assume that these promotion decisions are occurring within 5 different divisions of the organization. And let's also assume that each division has a different decision maker. So when we repeat this analysis and we look at each division individually, we see that for corporate services, there's a female promotion shortfall of 8.4, and this disparity is not statistically significant. When we look at the healthcare services division, we see a female promotion shortfall of negative 12.3. This means we promoted 12.3 females more than expected. So instead of a shortfall, we have a surplus of female promotions. And that outcome actually favors females. And when we look at campus services, we see a female promotion shortfall of 1.8. And this disparity is not statistically significant. Looking at school services, we see a female promotion shortfall of negative 2.9. Again, this disparity favors females. We promoted 2.9 females more than we would have expected. So again, we have a female promotion surplus. And looking at the final division, headquarters, we see a female promotion shortfall of 21.5. And this disparity is statistically significant. So among the 5 divisions, we have one disparity that's statistically significant. We have 2 divisions that have a female promotion shortfall, but that's not statistically significant. And we see in the remaining 2 divisions, the promotion disparity actually favors females. We promoted more females than we would have expected. In this case, there's no commonality. Because we see different results, different directions of surplus or shortfall in each of the divisions, there's no commonality. It's not likely that there's a common explanation to the female promotion shortfall in each of these divisions. What you might infer from this analysis is that the headquarters division is really different from the other 4 divisions. There may be a bad apple, so to speak, in the headquarters division, but the disparities are not statistically significant and in fact favor females in some cases in the other divisions. So a follow-up analysis should really focus on the headquarters division and try to understand what's going on in that particular division that's creating a statistically significant female promotion shortfall. Let's now turn to a discussion of class certification analyses versus merits analyses. And I'd like to say at the beginning that the 2 analyses are really intertwined. It's difficult to perform a class certification analysis without looking at the merits to some extent. And I'd also like to say that I'm not a lawyer. I am an economic and statistical consultant, so I will defer to the legal community as to whether or not the analysis is appropriate for class certification if it contains too much merit analysis. But what I can tell you about is a Supreme Court decision called Eisen versus Carlisle and Jacqueline. In its 1974 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States held that judges should not conduct a preliminary inquiry into the merits of a suit as part of the decision whether to certify a class. And that decision said, plaintiffs submit expert opinions to show that the contested issues can be decided on the basis of common proofs that would apply to all class members. Defendants offer their own expert testimony to show that trial of the claims would instead depend on individual proofs specific to each plaintiff's case. Now, this expert testimony bears directly on the commonality requirements for class certification. But it also concerns the merits of the case. If we think back to the promotion example we talked about with the 5 different divisions, that analysis is designed to examine the commonality question. But it's also, in some respects, examining the merits of the issue. And we see that in 2 of those 5 divisions, there was actually a surplus of female promotions. So that result, that outcome of that analysis, could be used by defendants to argue that there really were no merits to the case in terms of gender discrimination with respect to promotion. So there's a great deal of overlap between class certification and merits analyses. And what we oftentimes see, even though it's not supposed to happen, what we oftentimes see is dueling statistical experts at the class certification stage. And that brings us to our first court example, the decision in Randall versus Rolls-Royce. Sally Randall and Rona Pepmeyer were high-level female managers at Rolls-Royce's Indianapolis facility, which was formerly known as Allison Engine Company. Ms. Randall and Ms. Pepmeyer claimed they were paid less than their male counterparts, they were passed over for promotions, and they witnessed male executives putting down women. The plaintiffs were seeking class certification. In March of 2010, the Honorable Sarah Evans Barker of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Indiana denied certification of a putative gender discrimination class claim in Randall v. Rolls-Royce. Judge Barker's decision is interesting because of its thorough analysis of competing statistical evidence before the court. The decision highlights the importance of powerful expert reports and expert testimony in class actions. Judge Barker's decision turned largely on her resolution of competing statistical evidence offered by each party's expert. Unlike some other judges who've been reluctant to delve too deeply into expert testimony, her opinion explained at the outset: if there is a dispute as to the value or applicability or efficacy of either side's expert statistical analysis, the way in which that dispute is resolved impacts both the underlying systemic discrimination claim and the determination of whether a viable class action exists. In her decision, Judge Barker acknowledged that the commonality requirement of Rule 23A for class certification is a relatively low hurdle. She concluded that the requirement was not met here, in this case, primarily because the plaintiff's expert's statistical analysis was not convincing. This is partly because of variables that the plaintiff's expert failed to account for in its analysis, and its questionable definition of the relevant pool of employees to study. Judge Barker concluded that the defendant's expert has, in our view, convincingly demonstrated that there is no common gender effect across the putative class. The court credited the defendant's expert's approach to defining the relevant population for analysis and the unique studies of the varying gender effects in compensation observed across different salary grade levels, business units, and time periods. Judge Barker's decision goes on to also discuss, in detail, the statistical evidence relating to the typicality requirement of Federal Rule 23A. Similar to her findings with commonality, she adopted the conclusions of the defendant's expert as substantially more convincing than the less substantially complete analysis of the plaintiff's expert. Throughout the Randall decision, the significance of careful attention to expert reports and expert testimony in discrimination class actions is evident. The court's favorable view of the defendant's expert analyses demonstrates the benefits of close collaboration between counsel as the masters of factual record and relevant legal principles and statistical experts. This collaboration ensures that the statistical models are tracking the actual decision-making processes at issue, and that those analyses are aligned with the relevant legal inquiries under Rule 23. The second case I'd like to discuss is Dukes v. Wal-Mart. On April 26th of 2010, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit affirmed in part and reversed in part the class certification order in Dukes v. Wal-Mart Stores. Dukes v. Wal-Mart Stores is a gender discrimination pay and promotion class action encompassing approximately 1.5 million employees. The Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit addressed several cutting-edge class action issues in its ruling. The court clarified Rule 23 class certification standards. It said district courts are required to undertake rigorous analysis of legal or factual issues necessary to determine that each requirement of Rule 23 is met and not merely alleged, even if those legal or factual issues also go to the merits of the claim. The practical result of the Dukes decision is that any attack on the statistical presentation of a plaintiff's expert during the class certification stage must focus on commonality issues under Rule 23A2 rather than on merit-based arguments. The ruling also discussed the impact of expert testimony on the Rule 23 process. The court rejected Wal-Mart's contention that the expert testimony offered by plaintiffs should be stricken under Daubert, and the court held that Wal-Mart's objections went to the persuasiveness of the testimony and not its admissibility under the expert testimony standard. The ruling did not decide whether Daubert has the same application for expert testimony offered at the class certification stage as it does for testimony offered at trial. The ruling permits defendants to argue that a plaintiff's expert presentations are flawed and that they lack a theoretical basis to qualify as sufficient for class certification requirements. It seems as though the court's ruling in Dukes v. Wal-Mart is still going to allow statistical dueling and battling experts, but the ruling limits the questions over which statistical experts are permitted to battle. The ruling said that defendants should avoid arguments over which competing model is the more persuasive at the class certification stage. Defendants should consider instead the proper type of analysis in terms of the proper theoretical model for challenging commonality. And the example in the Dukes v. Wal-Mart case is the presentation of nationwide aggregated statistics by the plaintiff's expert versus regional statistics offered by the defendant's expert. The Ninth Circuit's en banc ruling in Dukes v. Wal-Mart affirmed the district court's certification of a class of female employees who were employed by Wal-Mart when the lawsuit was filed in 2001 with respect to their claim of injunctive relief, declaratory relief, and back pay under Rule 23b-2. It reversed and remanded class certification of employees' claims for punitive damages and instructed the district court to consider whether to certify the class under the newly Euclidated standards of Rule 23b-2 or 23b-3. It reversed and remanded claims of putative class members who no longer worked for Wal-Mart when the complaint was filed in 2001. It instructed the district court to consider whether to certify an additional class or classes under Rule 23b-3. Finally, it affirmed the district court's decision not to certify promotion claims brought by class members who lacked objective evidence of their interest in promotion. In remanding the claims of the employees not employed by Wal-Mart when the complaint was filed, the class size was effectively reduced from 1.5 million people to approximately 500,000 people. In remanding the punitive damages certification, the Ninth Circuit may have significantly reduced Wal-Mart's potential liability, but the district court may certify additional classes for punitive damages for the 1 million putative class members. In conclusion, statistical analysis can be used to address the commonality and typicality requirements of Rule 23a. And there's 3 steps to every comparative statistical analysis. First, we determine the expected outcome. We then compare the expected and the actual outcomes to calculate a disparity measure. And finally, we assess the statistical significance of the disparity. Statistical significance refers to the likelihood that the difference between expected and actual outcomes occurred due to simple chance. And the Hazelwood School District decision gives us a guideline for statistical significance. It said a disparity of at least 2 or 3 standard deviations is statistically significant. We talked about how statistical analysis can be used to address questions of typicality. An overall disparity can be used to argue for typicality, while an absence of a disparity can be used to argue a lack of typicality. We also talked about commonality. Similar outcomes across different comparison groups can be used to argue commonality. Different outcomes across different comparison groups can be used to argue lack of commonality. And the key to these analyses is how we construct those comparison groups. We want our comparison groups to follow the actual decision-making process of the organization. We looked at the Randall versus Rolls-Royce decision, and we saw that Judge Barker argued for a thorough analysis of competing statistical evidence. Judge Barker's decision highlights the importance of powerful expert reports and expert testimony in class action litigation. Finally, we talked about Dukes versus Wal-Mart. The Ninth Circuit's ruling addressed several cutting-edge class action issues. The ruling requires rigorous analysis of legal or factual issues to determine whether or not each requirement of Rule 23 is met, even if those issues also go to the merits. The ruling allows for statistical dueling, but limits the issues over which that battle can take place. The focus should be on commonality issues and not on merits-based issues. Statistical analysis plays a key role in addressing the typicality and commonality requirements of class certification under Rule 23.